So I wasn't going to do a video about the situation involving Dan Abbott for a few reasons. I don't think it's my lane. Woohoo, another white guy talking about racism, just what the world needs. I think there are people who can speak more eloquently and more importantly from lived experience. And I think those voices need to be at the very fore. For that reason, I turned down media bids about the issue. Now a couple of days has passed. I run a left-wing channel. A left-wing MP has been suspended from the Labour Party. You know, I felt maybe say something. And what I'm going to do is speak as thoughtfully as I can. I may get some of this wrong. And the comment section is there for people to contribute and to say where I get things wrong, as always. Now, this concerns those who don't know a letter which Dan Abbott sent to The Observer. Let's just read it. Tamawa Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish and traveller people all suffer from racism, in inverted quotes. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote, and at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. Now, before discussing this letter, which is wrong, and has upset people, particularly, obviously, those people affected, people, we're talking, of course, people from Gypsy Roman traveller communities, Jewish people, Irish people, which it is important to note and to emphasise that Diane promptly disowned and disassociated herself from. So those defending the letter on her behalf are defending a letter she herself has repudiated. I think it's important to say that. But what I'm going to do is repeat something which has been said by a number of people, but I'm going to say it again to explain why it's important, which is that as a black woman, Diane has been subjected to anti-black racism her entire life, which has been specifically magnified by three things. One, that she was the first black woman elected to Parliament nearly 4 decades ago. Two, that she's on the left. And three, that she's been an uncompromising public vocal opponent of racism her entire life. Now, in 2017, she received nearly half of the abusive tweets sent to female MPs in the run-up to the election. So nearly more than all other female MPs combined. That's just one example of the racism that's defined her entire life and which was profoundly magnified by her public political life. Now, I'm not saying this as a throat-clearing exercise, as a caveat, as a preamble before condemnation. It's certainly not a means, as some have done, of suggesting that somehow Diane should be held to a higher standard because she's a victim of racism, which I find, frankly, perverse in its implications. It's a necessary context because the letter, in my view, should be understood, and the letter is wrong, and we'll go through why, but it comes from a place of hurt, not of hatred or bigotry. I think it's so important to say that. Now, no white person, myself obviously included, can ever truly understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of anti-black racism. I've listened as best I can to black friends all my life about their experiences. I've conducted numerous interviews with black people specifically about their experiences of racism, but being on the receiving end of anti-black racism, which is ingrained in the institutions of this country and the very fabric of our society, which can be seen from everything from police harassment to microaggressions in the workplace, and the lived impact of that can never truly be understood unless you're on the receiving end. It's literally impossible, however much empathy you might happen to have. And that's why this letter should be understood as coming from a place of hurt, in a sense that does exist among many black Britons, that their lived experience of racism is not being listened to and is not being taken seriously, which is a sense which is more than justified on its own terms. Now, let's talk about the letter and why it's wrong, which is its implication that Jewish travellers and Jewish people, travellers and Irish people cannot suffer racism, but rather instead prejudice, not racism, on account of being white presenting, and the comparison of their experiences to that towards white people with red hair. Now, I mean, look, the concept of white historically isn't a static concept. There's no objective basis for race. You have minorities which are racialized, and that's the basis of racism. Now, obviously, the basis for anti-black racism is slavery and colonialism. That is a rationale for enslaving and subjugating black people by presenting them as inferior. In the case of Ireland, the centuries-long subjugation of Irish people by Britain, which in the mid-19th century alone caused half the population of Ireland to starve or flee. That led to the racialisation, that subjugation of Irish people as a basis to discriminate against them, including here in Britain. For Jewish people, 19th century anti-Semitism specifically racialised them. You have 2 millennia of anti-Semitism. The racialisation came in the 19th century, by which I mean before that, if you were Jewish but you converted to Christianity, then you could no longer be treated as Jewish. But from the late 19th century onwards, particularly German anti-Semites propagated the idea that a Jewish person was always Jewish, regardless of religious identity, i.e. they were racialised. That became, of course, the basis of the Holocaust, which took the biological racial pseudoscience of the 19th century to its logical genocidal endpoint. Now, Diane notably listed historical examples, but notably not this one, in which Jews were racialised. And it wasn't about your religious observance. Less than half of European Jews practiced some form of Judaism on the eve of World War II. You could be a hardened atheist. That would not have saved you from the genocidal ambitions of Hitlerism. And indeed, it didn't. Now, Jewish people today present in lots of different ways. Some white presenting, certainly. Some Jews are black, who can suffer anti-black racism and anti-Semitism. There are those. If you take my best straight friend, I was best man at his wedding. At university, a lot of people presumed he's from the Indian subcontinent. You have Haredi Jews outside of Israel. They're concentrated in places like London, Stamford Hill, or North Manchester, New York, visibly Jewish, and suffer anti-Semitism on that account. Now, Jewish people, of course, suffer in this country hate crimes, which are rising. Anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic hate crimes are rising. And, you know, what we're talking about there is racism. You know, as a form of conspiratorial thinking as well, anti-Semitism is embedded in certain sections of British society. Outright anti-Semitism. I mean, polling suggests that significant numbers of Britons, by which we mean millions and millions of British adults, believe classic anti-Semitic tropes such as Jews control the media or chase money. That's racism. Now, what you can hear from those tropes, and this is why it's important to talk about racism here, is it's not people objecting to Jewish people based on the Torah or something, is it? It's not based on religious doctrine. I don't think the vast majority of people understand anything about Judaism beyond their own understanding of the Old Testament from a Christian perspective, or maybe something vaguely picked up in religious education back in high school. It's based on bigoted behavioural assumptions supposedly inherent to Jews as a group, often based on conspiratorial thinking. And that's what that racialisation, of course, leads to. Now, as for Gypsies, Roma and Traveller, well, in the UK alone, few minorities suffer the level of discrimination that they suffer. Whatever the colour of their skin, they are racially othered. You have huge levels of poverty amongst GRT people, and political parties whipping up bigotry against them. I'll come on to that. And indeed massive discrimination. And the evidence suggests widespread police bigotry towards GRT people. As another example, you've got multiple cases of pubs in this country who refuse to serve GRT people. Now, in some cases, they've been fined for doing so. But how many have got away with it? Of course, we'll never know. Partly because that racism is not properly taken seriously often in our society. And it's often deliberately stoked by those with power. Now, there is a discussion, of course, which is about how racism affects different people differently. Not in order to construct a hierarchy, but because, you know, every experience, whether you're black, you're Jewish, you're Irish, or GRT, should be acknowledged for what it is. The reason for understanding those differences is because different experiences require different approaches to fight them. If we talk about anti-black racism, as I've said, we're talking about something which is institutionally ingrained in society. It's systemic racism. Take the Metropolitan Police, found to be institutionally racist, as the Macpherson report found after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, but as recently found by Louise Casey's inquiry recently. So are other police forces. Black people are far more likely to be stopped and searched on suspicion of possessing drugs, and far more likely to be charged if found with possession of, say, cannabis or cocaine. There are much higher levels of poverty if you're black, of unemployment. A study last year found that anti-black racism is hardwired into our housing system. You're far more likely to suffer homelessness even when controlling for socio-economic factors. A study found in 2021 that 2/3 of black employees experienced racism. Now, I'm going to make a point to try and flesh this out in terms of how different experiences, which doesn't mean they're not valid in their own different ways, which is in my own lane, which isn't about racism, and just see where I go with this. So I'm a gay man. I've suffered homophobia, up to and including violence. A neo-Nazi got sent to prison for gay bashing me on my birthday a few years ago. I do get homophobic abuse, threats of violence, of death. There are cases of systemic homophobia. The police, you had a serial killer, the so-called Grindr serial killer who targeted gay men, and the police failings were correctly labelled as institutional homophobia. And Louise Casey's report recently found that alongside institutional racism and misogyny, the police were institutionally homophobic, the Metropolitan Police. Now, that all said, I would not compare or dream of comparing my experience as a minority to that of black people. That's not to belittle homophobia or say homophobia doesn't matter. I obviously don't believe that. I think homophobia is extremely serious. Now, and look, it's obviously also true that gay people can present in different ways. Some present more in ways which are more likely to have them identified as gay to homophobes. But you're not universally instantly identifiable walking down the street, being at school, applying for a job, being in a workplace in a way that bigots can act on. And we can't talk about, for example, disproportionate incarceration or police harassment on the streets of gay people. I don't think there's compelling evidence about disproportionate levels of unemployment or poverty amongst gay people. It's not the same, is it? And that doesn't belittle homophobia. And obviously I want gay people and black people who are an overlapping category, because you have people who are gay and black, whose experience again is again, I should say this, it's a universe away from me. The experience of a black gay man is so different from that of my own and requires actually quite distinct approaches, including where racism, homophobia can overlap. Now, the reality of anti-black racism is you're always identified as black to anti-black racist, to those acting on the anti-black racism which is woven into the very fabric of our societies. If you take the US, for example, slavery was only abolished 2 lifetimes away. It's very, very recent, and the impact of that today remains absolutely huge. Now, there's a particular experience of racism specific to black people which doesn't in any way detract from the seriousness of racism that Jewish people face on its own terms, of course. Look, as one Jewish leftist put it, who called Diane's letter deeply ill-advised, which is correct. I'm saying this as a Jewish person. Nobody seriously thinks that Jewish people face the same kind of racism as black people. And if they say they do, they're either lying for political reasons or just don't care about anti-black racism. I think that's a completely reasonable point which can be had in a nuanced way, which doesn't detract or should not detract from building solidarity between, for example, GRT people, black people and Jewish people. And that principle of solidarity is obviously undermined by what Diane wrote. That letter was understandably condemned by organisations representing Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people. And the one thing we need now is for solidarity between minorities against the common enemy, which is racism. Now, the final part a couple of points I want to make about the Labour Party response. It's notable that Keir Starmer responded to Diane's letter by calling it anti-Semitic and ignoring the other groups mentioned, while farcically saying there can be no hierarchy of racism within the Labour Party. Now, which he's done himself by only talking about anti-Semitism. That is absolutely ridiculous. Now, if you take Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people, little surprise there, because anti-GRT racism is absolutely rampant in both Labour and the Conservatives. In 2021, for example, Labour issued an election leaflet committing to dealing with traveller incursions. I mean, what do you even say? Incursion, it's a military term. The definition being an invasion or attack. Talking about a minority, dealing with an invasion by a minority in this country. I mean, it's just gratuitous racism, straightforward pandering to and inciting hatred against travellers. Now, in terms of other examples about the factional nature of how this is all dealt with, take the right-wing Labour MP Barry Shearman in 2020 tweeted about 2 Jewish businessmen getting a seat in the House of Lords, saying apparently there's been a run on silver shekels. Straightforward anti-Semitism. No action taken against him. He apologised. He was allowed to apologise, as Diane did. And then a Labour spokesperson said Barry has deleted the tweets and apologised. He deeply regrets the offence caused. Why no action taken against him? Because of the faction he belongs to. He's loyal to the leadership. If that was a Labour MP who'd tweeted that, are you kidding me? They'd been out immediately. Like that. Absolutely no questions asked. Another example, Steve Reid, right-wing Labour MP, now in the shadow cabinet, described a Jewish Conservative donor as a puppet master for the entire Tory cabinet. Clearly an anti-Semitic trope, talking about Jews being puppet masters, one of the oldest tropes there is to do with anti-Semitism. Again, if he was a left-wing MP, are you kidding me? I mean, this guy's now in the shadow cabinet. Ridiculous. So, the Ford report, what that did is spoke of how senior Labour staff displayed deplorably factional and insensitive and at times discriminatory attitudes. It said some anti-Corbyn elements of the party seized on anti-Semitism as a way to attack Jamie Corbyn, and his supporters saw it as simply as an attack on the leader and his faction, with both sides just weaponising the issue and failing to recognise the seriousness of anti-Semitism. Now, it's, I think, striking that only the latter point of that has ever been properly discussed and debated in the media, and not the former point. And actually, if you discuss the former point without referring to the Ford report, you'd probably be kicked out of the Labour Party. And the Ford report, to be clear, Martin Ford was commissioned, he's a senior barrister, KC, he was commissioned by Keir Starmer himself, and that's the report that he came up with in response to leaked messages from senior Labour staff. And he said since that Labour hasn't engaged with claims that anti-black racism and Islamophobia are not taken as seriously as anti-Semitism, this perception of a hierarchy of racism within the Labour Party. Now, on Diane Abbott, finally, there was clear delight amongst a certain type of white person, racists, who delight in being able to call a black woman a racist. They hate Diane Abbott, above all else, because she's a prominent black politician who has spoken about anti-black racism all her life. And that causes rage amongst a certain type of white person in this country. It is absolutely, inarguably the case. That's what's triggering them, as they would say, on the right wing of British politics. That's what's offended them. That's what's distressed them. So it's turning the tables on or shining a light on anti-black racism in British society. And they're delighting in being able to go, aha, now we get to call you the real racist. When obviously the real issue is the racism which she and others suffer. Now, what she wrote was wrong, and she was right to apologise for it. It does need to be recognised that it came from a place of hurt and trauma. She should be readmitted to the Labour Party, as somebody who is, above all else, a victim of racism. And what she wrote was clearly wrong and insensitive. But you can see the factional way that discipline is dealt with. And, you had the HRC report, which said that the leadership needed to stay out of these disciplinary cases. And we've already had the likes of Keir Starmer prejudging any inquiry into what she wrote. Labour need to get their own house in order. They need to act on what the Ford report said about this perception of a hierarchy of racism. We should have a discussion, for example, about racism towards Gypsy, Roma, Traveller people, which Keir Starmer clearly has no interest in, which is why he hasn't mentioned that component of the letter. These are issues that need to be stripped away from factional considerations. And we need to understand racism as something which is rooted in our society, in our politics, in that broader context, rather than what has become, clearly, within the Labour Party, something which can't be taken out of a profoundly factional context. And that has nothing to do with fighting racism in any way. And I have to say, whatever people feel rightly about how wrong that letter was, it is, I think, pretty nauseating to see people getting off calling somebody who is a black woman, the first black female MP who, against all the odds, was elected in 1987, who has been a victim of racism all her life. They're getting off calling her racist. It is disgusting. And it should be called out for what it is. That's my take. I'm sure it was a long video that I didn't get right. Should I have done a video at all? Open question. But I did want to say something. Please like and subscribe and support us on patreon.com/Andreas84. I'll see you in a bit.